I do welcome you back. This is a long wait since COVID to come back into this place. Patty, I thank you for allowing me to twist your arm into the chair. I surprised her with the camera too. So the camera is only this direction, but everything we do these days, we need to be able to try to share with our wider community. So that's the point of the camera. We have 2 weeks let's talk about grief. And thank you for being here. Thank you for this support. And thank you, Patty. You appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm so glad it's not thousands of people. I had a dream last week when I started my grief support group. I had a dream that there were going to be 32 people. And I panicked. So this is a nice number. So my name is Patty. I'm the Director of Visitation Ministry here at Immanuel. It's a part-time job. I've been doing it for about 10 years. I didn't realize it's been that long. What I do is I visit people that are isolated or maybe fragile in health. I visit hospitals, nursing homes, hospice care, rehab centers, assisted living, and private homes. And visiting with people, I've come into contact with a lot of grief. Part of what I also do is I'm a Stephen minister. So one of the resources that I have is a set of 4 books. When someone is experiencing grief due to the death of a loved one, if I know the name, address, and maybe the date of death, I'm able to send a series of 4 books. These are through Stephen Ministry. They are small, easy to read, one step at a time. The first book I send out at 3 weeks after the death. It's called A Time to Grieve. Gives people a focus on being able to grieve. The second book I send out at 3 months after the death. This is Experiencing Grief, giving the individual time and permission to do grieving, and some suggestions about that process. This book goes out at 6 months after the death. It's called Finding Hope and Healing. A lot of time, it gives permission again to continue your grieving, but also gives some steps for looking for hopeful things. And the 4th book I sent out at the 11 months after the death, when folks are getting close to that 1-year anniversary of the death of a loved one. Sometimes they feel anxiety, sometimes they're hearing from their friends, oh, you need to move on. It's been a year, get over it, kind of thing. This is called Remembering and Rebuilding. It's not about forgetting the loved one, but then moving with that. That's from Stephen's ministry. It's very helpful. I have used it for the 10 years that I've been here. I needed something a little more. Because in 2020, COVID happened. And my visitation stopped. I couldn't go visit folks. In fact, it stopped right at the beginning of Lent. I had just visited with 12 people, put ashes on their foreheads, so I was in close contact with folks that are a little frail with health reasons. And I was worried that maybe I had passed something on. We didn't know very much about COVID. We didn't really know how it was passed. We were all kind of nervous. And as a staff, we had to shut down. We weren't able to go out and visit. We were scrambling to put service online. That was just a real hard time. We couldn't even meet for staff meetings. We Zoomed and we did our distancing. And what we were doing was grieving. So I went online with the help of our secretarial staff, and found something called Good Grief. This is also from a Christian point of view. The first one is gives some explanation about grieving, what happens with grief, what kind of emotions you feel with grief. Again, a short, easy to read kind of book. But it's a 3-book series, and what we used as a staff was there were 52 weeks of devotions. And so when we met for staff meeting, we would do a devotion. I didn't use all 52 because for the nature of what we do in the church, we had to come to grips with this faster than what normal people do when they grieve. But we use these devotions. The third part of this set is a journal. And even though I'm a former English teacher, I don't like to write. But I have used this with people who do like to journal. And it follows the same themes of the book, but gives you space, questions to actually write and talk about what's going on with grief. So that was helpful. But both of these sets are only for the loss of a loved one. And I found that, especially with COVID, it reminded me that I didn't know anybody that was sick yet, and I hadn't lost anybody to COVID yet. But I was still grieving what was going on. So I went back online, and I took a look at Grief Recovery Method Institute. They're located in Bend, Oregon. They've been in there for over 30 years. And their definition of grief is what I wanted, what I needed. Grief is the normal and natural reaction to a loss of any kind. So that opened it up. It wasn't just the death of a loved one, it was any kind of loss. And grief is the conflicting feelings caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. Wow, that helped explain. When COVID happened, everything stopped. That familiar pattern stopped. And we were grieving that. How do we look at that? Let's think a little bit about conflicting emotions. So my mom was in the first graduating class of Oregon State that allowed women in the School of Pharmacy. She was one of 3 women in the graduating class. She then went on to teach for a year at Oregon State in the School of Pharmacology, and then she worked as a pharmacist in drugstores. She was a pharmacist for 50 years, independent, strong. She took care of my older brother who's special needs, had arranged for him to be independent, live in his own place. She retired, and then she had a stroke. It affected her right side. She could no longer walk. She could no longer speak clearly. I became the caregiver. I became the power of attorney. I had to make hard decisions for her medically. She had to live in assisted living. She could no longer live on her own. And then she died. 2 years later, she died. And my conflicting feelings were with that death was one of relief. I no longer had to make that trip from Salem to Corvallis every week, a couple times a week. I no longer had to make those hard decisions for her that I knew she didn't like. She let me know she didn't like it. I no longer had to watch this strong woman struggle. Because of her faith, I knew that she was in a better place. So I was relieved. I was happy. She had just had communion with her pastor. It was Christmas season. That was her favorite time of the year. She breathed deeply and was gone. It was a wonderful, easy passage. So I was happy about that. But I was also extremely sad. I was drained. I was exhausted. There were those conflicting emotions involved with that. With this definition of looking at grief, broadening that out, I was really grieving. Happy and sad at the same time. So let's talk a little bit about conflicting feelings. Have any of you known a senior in high school or ever been a senior in high school? How is that last year? What's going on in the mind of that senior? Any kind of conflicting? What's going on?
Well, there's transition. It's the best time of your life because you're at the top of the ladder, and yet you're going to be put down at the bottom again. And it's a start over, and then it's an independent start over.
Independent start over. And maybe I don't really want to start cooking on my own. I don't really want to have to do my own laundry. But boy, I get to move out of the house. It is a conflicting time, good and bad. It's that change of familiar behavior or pattern that's a grieving time. So let's think about some other times where we might have grief with change in pattern or behavior. Any ideas?
Maybe moving somewhere new.
Absolutely, absolutely. The excitement of moving, but then you're leaving familiar area. You know, your friends. You know where the grocery store is. Yeah, thank you. Anything else?
Divorce.
Divorce, absolutely. Maybe it was a caustic relationship, you're glad to be out of it, but also the amount of time that you spent in that relationship, there's that grief there, conflicting. Anything else?
Retirement.
Yeah, tell me about retirement.
Well, I'm easing into it. I thought I was going to retire and then said, oh my goodness, I'm not going to stop working all of a sudden. So now I just work 2.5 days instead of 4.5 days. But yeah, I mean, and then you have to sort of roll it around, say, okay, what am I going to do with my 24 hours?
Yeah.
You know, what am I going to do? I have to do something. And what is that?
Yes, yes. There might also be questions, financial questions. Can I afford to retire?
Mm-hmm.
How's that going to all work? Health insurance, where does that come from if you retire?
Losing or starting a new job.
Excellent, thank you. That's right. If you get, even if it's a promotion, and you might be getting more money in, you might, but now you have more responsibilities. Or losing your job, that's a financial thing too. How am I going to make rent? How am I going to buy food? Thank you.
Aging.
Danny, what about that one?
You've been an adult and you've been independent and you've been strong and you've been powerful, and all of a sudden you may not be as strong and you may not be as independent. You may have to give up a driver's license. Your body is changing. Your mind is changing.
Yes.
The world is changing.
Yes. Anything else? How about buying your first home? That's a change. Might be exciting. You've picked out the perfect place. You've always wanted to have a porch.
How about getting married or...
Absolutely.
Like we talked about divorce, but then getting married.
Getting married. Why is that conflicting? What's conflicting about getting married?
It's happy, but then it's a change.
It's a change. Absolutely. You have to now figure in with somebody else. You have to make maybe compromises. Maybe now you're in charge of the laundry.
Or having a baby also.
Thank you. That's very good. It's an exciting time, but what do I do with this little dependent? They don't come from home with owner's manuals. There's no directions. They just say, oh, you'll figure it out. How about empty nesting? Those of you that have had children and they've moved on. How's that?
There's a party.
It was a party. Yes.
Well, the difference is that we had 4 leave home, and that was okay, and the 2 were coming that were going to be graduating from high school and moving on to whatever. And then the older 3 came back.
Yes.
So when the older 3 left, it was like a party. It's like, okay, they can go now, because it was time for them to go.
You loved them.
I loved them,
Nothing to do with that.
and we loved them.
That's right.
I guess this has to do with death, but losing a pet. I
Yes.
lost one of those this year, so
Dog, cat,
dog.
dog. That's hard, isn't it?
Yeah,
That's part of your family.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be like a person who dies. It could be.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. How about starting school? Any of you, some of you are in the education field, so that first day of school is kind of exciting. But what about those little guys that are starting school for the first time?
They can't line up.
They
It's
can't-
very hard.
They
They just don't know. And where is the bathroom? Did anybody tell them? I don't remember.
Starting a new school too.
Starting a new school, absolutely. I went to a small Lutheran school. There were 50 students in 8 grades. My class had 3. There were 3 in my 8th grade class. When I graduated, each one of us went to a different junior high. So I knew absolutely nobody. And I had to share a locker with somebody I didn't know. In my old school, we didn't even have lockers. We had cubby holes. We put our coat on the back of our chair. Starting a new school, absolutely. How about if there's a death, if there's a divorce, what about death of a former spouse? That might be a time to do grieving but conflicting emotions there, depending how the divorce went. What about, I love this one. I was with Patty Lowe. She's a member of our congregation, and her phone updated.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Patty Lowe has vision problems, so she has set up her phone to be large in print, and she knows where her little buttons are for who she calls. Overnight, she woke up and it had been automatically updated, and now it was back to the original little print, and all the pictures were different. There wasn't much good about that. And the emotions weren't conflicting, but she was trying very hard not to throw the phone. What about holidays? Any of you get a little tense right before Christmas? Or major holidays? Yeah. My husband and I usually fight right before Christmas. We come from different kinds of family backgrounds, and our idea of what a holiday looks like, even after 40 years, is still different. And there's that conflicting emotion, which, yeah.
Or birthdays, like birthdays of maybe people who have passed away.
Yes. Most of these are not seen as grieving events, but they really are. When we broaden out our definition for grief to be the conflicting emotions of an ending of or a change in a behavior pattern. What about things like loss of trust or loss of safety?
Loss of a loved one due to substance abuse or alcoholism.
Yes. End of addiction is also a time to grieve. When you've depended on a substance for so long and now you're clean and sober, there is that grieving time. Come on in.
Hello.
Hi, come on
Sorry
in.
to interrupt you.
You're fine. We're talking about the conflicting emotions with life-changing events.
That's why she said I should come in here.
All right, you're in the right place.
Thank you.
What about loss of faith? We can talk about that here because we're in a church setting, but some of these events, divorce, death of a loved one, may cause us to question or lose our faith. There's grief involved with that. And often we don't get help. I know that's not true here, but in some churches I've heard the phrase, just pray harder. Or if your faith was stronger. That's not always helpful. Not all losses, not all grief is equal. First of all, we're all different, so we all grieve differently. Even siblings who have gone through the same death of a parent. I have two brothers, an older brother, a younger brother. When our mother died, we each grieved differently. Okay? Part of that is the intensity of the grief depends on the intimacy of the relationship and the duration of the relationship. So my older brother, who's special needs, lived with my mom for 52 years. She had just gotten him into a manufactured home on her property, so he was now living independently. After I graduated from high school, went to college, ran out of money, would move home. Would work, go back to college, ran out of money, would move home. It wasn't until I was married that I didn't really get to move home again, because my husband didn't want that. So my relationship with my mom, while maybe the same length of time, pretty close, we're all 2 years apart, the intimacy was different than my older brother and my mom's relationship. My younger brother, when he finally graduated from high school, moved out and never came back except at holidays when there was a free meal. He lived in the same town, but he didn't visit. When my mom had a stroke, he never visited her in the hospital, rehab center, or assisted living. His duration of relationship was about the same, but the intimacy of that relationship was different. So when my mother died, my older brother sobbed, but was able to write the epitaph on her gravestone. I couldn't do that. My younger brother, when our mother died, would have nothing to do with the arrangements. He did come to the funeral, had his cookies and coffee, and then left again. And I was kind of in the middle there because I had been her caretaker. Again, the relationship changed. There was more intimacy. I had been able to work through our relationship. And my grief was different. Same mom. We grew up in the same household, but our grief was different. So it depends on the intensity and duration of a relationship. So let's think about this. One example that comes to mind is the death of a child. Maybe a miscarriage or a stillborn child. The intimacy of the relationship between the mother and child starts early. She feels the change in her body. She's carrying the child. Her partner may not know right away that she's pregnant. The intimacy there is a different kind of intimacy. When the fetus, the baby dies, both parents grieve, but they will grieve differently. So, let's think of... So do you have any questions so far in what I'm talking about with grief? No.
I think there's a question of grieving. Is it to only be private and on your own, or is it something that can be visible, or there's what? What do you think?
Good question. Good question. We are made in community. We have been taught, however, to grieve alone. Men, I'm sorry, but you've been taught not to really show your emotions. That if you're going to cry, do it somewhere else. We may have heard this growing up. Well, I'm going to show you something to really cry about. Or, boys don't cry. Or, if women cry, it might be termed hysterical. Pull yourself together. Grieving, the process of grieving should be done in community. But we're often not taught how to do that. The first two resources that I had, the Good Grief and Journeying Through Grief, kind of alluded to how to grieve, but they didn't give me steps on how to grieve. The grief recovery method gave me steps on when somebody tells me, oh, you can't miss it, and gives me general directions on how to get to a place, I always drive right by. But when I have specific, easy, simple, not necessarily easy, steps to follow, I can get to your house. I can get through grief if I know how to deal with it. And what's important is that grievers need to be listened to. You can't do that on your own. There may be a season and a time that you want to be alone so that you can think, so you're not confused, you're not bothered, people aren't pressing you to move on, people aren't asking you questions. But the whole process of grief is not alone. That sort of answer?
Mm-hmm.
Grievers are not broken. You have broken hearts. And how to get through that, how to mend that broken heart is important. And being listened to is part of that. Being listened to without judgment or criticism, or my favorite is advice. Well, when my Aunt Millie died, this is what I did to get over that grief. That's not helpful. It's not helpful for you because your grief is different than everyone else's. Any other questions?
That's what's so hard about the COVID, because things are so different coming out of the COVID, and
Yes.
what you can say and who you can say that to is so changed.
We're out of practice, aren't we? We had to hunker down. We had to isolate.
I think part of the COVID isolation is that we all had to grieve coming back out of it, because we were grieving in the middle of that isolation, because we are community.
Yes.
We are people of community,
Yes.
but we could not be community.
Yes.
I think one of the blessings that I had is with my work is that I had to still be in a room one-on-one. Some of them were Zoom meetings, but a lot of it you were still in the room with people, even though you were masked. And there were people I had never seen without a mask. So the next time I saw them without a mask, I didn't know who they were,
Yes.
because I had never seen them before. So it was kind of interesting.
Yes.
It was that interesting push-pull.
Mm-hmm.
And the fear of being in a room.
Mm-hmm.
Have I just been exposed? Will I take it home?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's another thing. Where grief happened is the world changing after COVID.
Yes.
Yeah. Or during COVID.
After COVID, different COVID. That's probably the only thing that we know for sure is that life will change. There will be
Any
change.
change can.
Any
yeah.
change. And I don't like change. And now I know why. It's because I'm grieving the familiar. I'm grieving what I have become used to.
Mm-hmm.
And to learn new skills, that's hard. That's hard. Any other questions?
Okay.
Now, I think we would all like to have whatever is causing our grief, we would like it to end, but it doesn't. I mean, it can be tabled, and then there's triggers.
Is
Yeah.
that helpful to shove it aside?
For a while.
Yes.
For a bit. Sometimes I do think it's helpful to put it aside for
Yes.
a bit so that when your soul is ready, you can take a look at it and do the process. Because sometimes you can't do the process right at the front.
Mm-hmm.
You have
That's
to
right.
do it later.
You have to do it when you're ready. Sometimes, for example, with the death of someone, the surviving person has to make decisions, has to make funeral arrangements, has to, all those decisions that come one right after another. That's why with the Stephen Ministry series, I don't send out that first book until 3 weeks after the death. Because things calm down a little bit. And now the person who is grieving maybe can have time to read something. Maybe the fog has lifted a little and they can understand something. Yes, isolation works, putting it aside works, but temporarily. Temporarily. There are other things that we do that help temporarily. Some of us use retail therapy. Some of us might drink or use drugs. Some of us might buy that retail therapy, buy stuff. Some of us might overcommit to things, get so busy that we push that grief to the side. If I just volunteer more, I'll feel better. But if we don't look at that grief and identify it, find out what the parts are and work through it, it's going to stay there. And what it'll do, Pastor Leah talks about a grief pocket. So if you tuck your grief down in there, you don't see it right away, but it festers while it's in that pocket. And it might show up later as an illness or a bad decision or somebody steps in front of you in the line in the grocery store and you get so angry you're shouting at them. Road rage is one of those things that if we don't deal with grief, if we don't work with it, it'll show itself out sometime. And maybe a small, something that goes wrong gets blown out of proportion. I don't know if that's ever happened to you. It has happened to me. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's why holidays are hard for me. Any other comments or questions?
I like the idea. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
The idea of the mask, and that was something that was kind of like it was for safety. It was a barrier. But then when it was removed, and I worked in a school, and all of a sudden these faces that you saw that had grown up, and they had become, just that whole other year older, and it was so exciting, and just kind of curious to see that change. And I think that with grief, when we're at a place, I think that there's that turning point where all of a sudden it's like, oh, we're moving on. We can do something new. And what a wonderful thing that was to all of a sudden see the whole person, because it was like we didn't know how not round that little face was anymore. And it was just sweet. It was sweet.
Yeah.
Well, there's also the change of growing up, or kids growing up, that
Yes.
people might have mixed feelings over.
Yes. I grieve my little boys being so nice and happy, and now that they're young men, they don't always agree with me. I grieve that. They have minds of their own.